Bending from one note to another is one of the most fundamental blues guitar techniques, but it can actually be one of the most tricky for beginners to get to grips with. Hello and welcome back to the channel on our continuing voyage to become better blues players. My name's Mark, and in this lesson we're going to look at the real intricacies of bending notes, particularly in the context of a blues, but actually in a wider context as well. So this lesson's aimed specifically at beginners. We're really going to get into the mechanics of how you bend notes and the different types of bends that we can apply to the blues. And then next week there'll be a follow-on lesson where we'll have an example solo with I think it's 9 or 10 licks, all using different types of bends to give you your bending a real workout. Okay, so when we're talking about pushing a note from one note to another, we're actually talking about doing this. We're gonna grab our string here. I'm going to start on the 11th fret, and I'm literally going to push the string, and what that does is it creates more tension in the string and the pitch goes up. So you get this. Okay, so we start here, we aim to end here, and we push it up. Okay, so one of the common things that beginners struggle with is exactly how you do that and getting enough strength in your fingers. The best way to do this, the correct technique, is you bend with your ring finger and you support that with your other two fingers on the previous 2 frets, and you push with all 3 fingers. So today we're going to be playing in the key of C. We're going to be jamming over this chord here, a C7. So we're going to push a B flat to become a C. And that's literally how you do it. You line your fingers up and push it and press across the string, push the string until it becomes the next note. Okay, so there's basically 2 types of bend. There's what I just showed there, which we'll call bending to a note. You start in one place, you aim to end in another place. So you're moving from a B flat to a C, for example. The other type of bend is what I call a dirty bend. And it's not where we're aiming to go to a note, it's where we start on a note and we're deliberately pushing it out of tune. It sounds wrong, but it actually really works, particularly in the context of blues. In fact, it's a technique that I don't actually see ever really being used anywhere else. And if you ever see like a rock guitar player playing a solo where they start doing this, suddenly it sounds more like a blues solo than a rock solo. Okay, so our first type of bend is bending to a note. And the most important thing when we're doing this is we have to get the note in tune. So when we start, it's where we end has to be in tune. So we're aiming for this, in this case, the C. We want to hit the C. How do we know when we've hit the C? That's the most common thing that a beginner struggle with, and how you can easily tell a beginner player, because when they're bending notes, usually they're not to tune, they're not to pitch, they're not in tune. So there's a couple of ways you can do this, and I have tried this. You can use a tuner and keep practicing to get your fingers and the muscle memory used to getting up to tune. Personally, I didn't find that you worked that well for me, but I know it works well for other people. For me, a better way of doing this was playing with lots of backing tracks and just being really careful and mindful when we're playing, when we're bending notes, making sure they're in tune with the backing track, and they'll just literally sound in tune, and sooner or later your fingers just learn the right amount to bend. Okay, so bending up to a note, that's what we've done there. The other one I mentioned was a dirty bend, bending away from a note. So I'm going to start this. We're in C. This is my root note. I'm going to take the minor third, which is this note here, and I'm going to pull it and literally just drag it out of tune. See how bluesy that sounds? Then if we just played it straight. Okay, so that's what I call a dirty bend. There's a couple of different varieties of doing that. And as I say, don't actually see that in any other style other than blues. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put on a backing track and I'm going to play through a whole different varieties of those 2 types of bends. Bends where we're bending to a note, bends where we're bending away from a note. Okay, and I'll come back on the other side. There's no tab for this. I'll just come back on the other side and I'll talk you through some of the more interesting ones. This is a list of all of the bends that I find that I use most often in a blues. Okay then, so I'm going to take you through a few of those in a little bit more detail. So first of all, the most common ones we have is where we're bending from the flat 7 to the root. So what does that mean? Well, our root is the key that we're in, so we're in the key of C. Our flat 7 is the one that's a whole tone below that. So our root is a C, 13th fret of the B string. Our flat 7 is 2 frets below that, and what we're going to do is we're going to bend up to the root. So you saw me do this one a few different ways. I'm going to bend up, hold it, and shake it. And that's probably the most common bend that there is. Couple of tricky things about this. We're going to go into this in real detail. So you're going to bend it with the 3 fingers, as I mentioned earlier. Now, when we shake a note, so what we're doing here is we're bringing it up and we're going to shake it. Now, when we shake a note normally, if I was just going to vibrato this C on itself. Okay, well, what's going on there? I'm grabbing the C, and then I'm pulling it slightly sharp and bringing it back. Slightly sharp and bringing it back, and I'm doing that very fast. So you get this, but the note's actually doing this. So the note is going sharp and back, sharp and back, sharp and back. With this, when we bend the note, the first mistake I made, and one of the reasons why I struggled with this technique for literally the first few years I was playing, is I was trying to replicate that. I was trying to bend the B flat to the C, and then push it sharp and bring it back, push it sharp and bring it back. And actually that's incredibly tricky. And actually the better technique is that we bend up to the C, and then what we do is we just release a little bit of pressure on our fingers, and it'll lower the pitch of the C, and then push it back up. So whereas a normal vibrato, we're at pitch and going up and back and up and back, this time we're going to bend up to pitch and then go down and up, down and up. Okay? Probably made it sound a little bit more tricky than it is, but the idea is, well, you get this. And the way I'm doing that is pushing it up and then slowly, not slowly, very quickly, releasing a little bit of pressure and then putting the pressure back on, releasing the pressure and putting the pressure back on. Okay, so a couple of variations on that. You can bend up and re-pick it. So one way of doing this is pick when we're at the B flat, bend it up and then re-pick at the C. You can re-pick several times. So you get those variations in when you bend up to the note, how far you come down, how quickly you go back up, how often you're picking in that. Those are all the things that make the subtle nuances of your playing. Okay, so let's look at dirty bends now. There's basically 2 types of dirty bend that I used in that solo. The first one is what we call a minor third to the roots. That's the one I showed before. Okay, but then there's also something which I call a snatch. I've got no idea what this is called, but this is when instead of, so that dirty bend, the way that's supposed to work is we're taking a note and we're slowly dragging it out of tune, and the more out of tune it goes, the more tense it gets before we resolve to our root note, which is like the most perfect note, the most harmonious note. So what we're doing is we're going tense, 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 resolve to the root. With a snatch, it's kind of like the opposite. We're at our root, and then we at the end of the note, we're just going to throw in this dirty, horrible little, as I say, snatch. We're going to grab the flat third and very quickly push it sharp and kill the note at the same time. So you get this. Okay, so you do that at the end of a lick. Okay, and yeah, I've heard blues players across the ages do that. Okay, other thing to mention about this dirty bend is when I do this, I'm using this, I'm going to show on this camera here, I'm going to use the side of my finger there, and what I'm doing is I'm using that to kind of pivot off the underside of the fretboard, so it allows me to do that kind of drag with just the one finger. So as I said before, usually we bend with 3 fingers. With a dirty bend, we're just using 1 finger, and I'm doing the kind of the same thing with the snatch as well. So that's kind of like the mechanics of how I do that. And finally then, let's talk about double string bends. This is where we're getting a little bit more adventurous. There's basically three types. There's ones where I'll use say these two frets here. And that's basically a variation on a double, on a dirty bend, except I'm using two strings. The other one, I call this the Leslie West bend because that's kind of where I first heard it. I'm going to bend up with the G string, and then when it gets to pitch, I'm going to grab the 11th fret of the B string as well, and then I'm going to go back to the G string and bring it down. So one string's going up and then coming back down, but when it gets to the top, I'm going to pick the string underneath it. So you get this. And you can do that there. Again, I'm in the key of C, so I'm bending a 4th up to the 5th, grabbing the flat 7 and then bringing it back down. And you can actually do them together. You can let them ring out. You can kind of play them as one note after each other. And there's all those kind of little subtle varieties you can do with them. You can also do the same thing, 15th fret of the B string, and we're going to grab the 15th fret of the top E underneath it as well. Leslie West's, he was in the band Mountain, what's the song, Mississippi Queen, superb example of that type of thing. He uses it kind of throughout that. If you've never checked out Leslie West, absolutely do so. Mountains, theme from Imaginary Western, Mississippi Queen, I mean, just killer songs. Anyway, he was great at bending and really influenced me. The other one, which is the same mechanical idea, you're doing this kind of same thing with our fingers, but we're doing it in a different place. This gives a more major sound. I call these the country bends. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, but we're still in the key of C. But I'm going to bend, what am I doing? I'm bending a 2nd up to a major 3rd with this finger. So it's exactly the same mechanics. I'm just doing it now where that's C there, that's the root note there. So I'm doing it, where are we? 7th fret. And you get this? It gives it a much more melodic feel. Now we can do exactly the same thing again, but instead of grabbing the B string, we're actually going to grab the top E string at the, what's that? That's the 8th fret. Now to do this, because there's a string in the middle, I pick on the G string and this finger here, middle finger on the top E, and you get this. And the idea is it's supposed to sound like a lap steel. I call that country blues, country bends. I don't know if there's a particular name for them. Same mechanics, as I said, as the Leslie West bends, except we're doing them with major notes instead. And then finally, let's talk about Albert King. So this is a series of bends that kind of feel like Albert King or Albert King's influence on Stevie Ray Vaughan. And everything I said before about where we're bending a note and we're using 3 fingers and we're supporting it, all of that kind of goes out the window, because Albert King would often bend with his index finger on its own. And I did a whole series on Albert King and how he bends and all those kind of things. And but that's where these licks came from, basically. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend up. What are we going to do? This. Or a kind of real Albert King style lick. 13th fret up a whole tone, then off to our index finger, which is on the 11th fret. We're going to go up half a tone, back down, and then off to our root, which is the 13th fret. And sometimes he wouldn't, that index finger, he'd push it a whole tone instead of half a tone. But you get those kind of things as well. So he was very, very fond of index finger bends. If you listen to Stevie Ray Vaughan's version of The Sky Is Crying, on the intro he's doing that kind of thing. In fact, I think that's where I first picked it up from. Okay, so that's a whole heap of different types of bends. And as I say, for beginners, a lot more detail, and we really went into the mechanics of how we're moving our fingers on this. Next week, there's going to be an example solo. I'm not going to do all the talking and re-explain all this. What I'm going to do is just give you an example solo that's got a whole bunch of these different types of bends in, so you've got something to practice. And I'll end now with I'll do some improvisation, 12-bar blues in C, and I'll try and throw as many different types of bends in as I can. Big thank you to the Patreon supporters who keep everything going, and for supporting me on Patreon. They get some extra lessons, and they get all my old lessons as well, all organised in collections, and they get all the materials and the PDFs and MP3 files and everything to go with them. So big thank you to them. Big thank you to everybody who leaves a tip in my PayPal tip jar to say thank you for helping them on their playing. And with that talking, I'll leave you and I'll do some improvisation with the names of the Patreon supporters on screen.